Welcome back to the Battlefield Brief, your weekly briefing on competitive Warhammer 40K. This week, we are looking at both sides of the tournament picture. First, we will break down the overall faction win rates, player counts, and 4-week trends. Then we will move beyond the headline numbers and examine the successful army lists that actually reached the top tables. This week, Black Templars was the biggest surprise in the data, finishing 6 points above its 4-week average. We begin with the full meta snapshot. This week's report draws from 23 events, 1,082 players, and 4,363 recorded games. This chart shows every faction's weekend win rate, from highest to lowest. Factions above 55% are outside the upper edge of the healthy range. Factions between 45 and 55% are inside the Goldilocks zone, while factions below 45% are under the target range. The current meta has 20 factions in the healthy 45 to 55% range, 1 faction above 55%, and 7 factions below 45%. That means 8 out of 28 factions are outside the 45 to 55% Goldilocks zone, which suggests the meta is relatively stable this week. Now, let's focus on the factions at the top of the weekend win rate chart. This view identifies the raw performance leader, but player count still matters. A striking win rate from a very small sample may be interesting, without yet representing a durable shift in the meta. Orcs posted the highest raw win rate at 63.5% across 58 players. Next, we compare this weekend's results against each faction's 4-week average. This chart highlights the armies that performed better than their recent trend would have predicted. The biggest overperformer was Black Templars. They came in at 50% this weekend, compared to a 4-week average of 44%. That is 6 points above their recent average. A sleeper faction to watch is Orcs. They finished at 63.5% with 58 players, and they were just over 3 points above their 4-week average. That is the kind of result that may become more important if it repeats next week. On the other side of the comparison, this chart shows the factions that fell furthest below their recent 4-week performance. A single poor weekend may be noise, but a large decline supported by meaningful player volume deserves attention. The biggest underperformer was Thousand Suns. They finished at 52.5% this weekend, compared to a 4-week average of just over 57%. That is just under 5 points below their recent average. Now we reach the trend watch. This chart places the weekend win rate next to the 4-week average. That helps separate a short-term spike from a result that is supported by recent performance and meaningful player volume. If we filter out tiny samples, Orcs had the strongest meaningful performance this week, posting a 63.5% win rate across 58 players. That combination of strong results and real player volume makes this one of the most credible performances in the data. The faction showing the clearest warning sign is Thousand Suns. They had 46 players, but finished just under 5 points below their 4-week average. That is worth watching, because it is not just a tiny sample. Win rate tells us which factions performed well, but player count tells us what competitors are actually bringing to events. This chart shows the most represented armies in the current sample. The most represented faction was Tau Empire, with 82 players. Importantly, they also stayed at just over 54%, which means their popularity is backed by a solid table performance. Before moving into the tournament list analysis, let's look at where this week's data came from. A larger field creates more games, more matchups, and a stronger overall sample. The largest event in this report was Path to Glory Open 2026, with 195 players. Now we move from overall win rates into tournament list intelligence. The current list sample contains 314 successful lists, including 69 that finished without a loss. This chart shows which factions produced those undefeated results, and what share of the undefeated sample each faction accounted for. Space Marines Astartes produced the most undefeated lists, with 11. That was just under 16% of the undefeated sample. Among factions with at least 3 successful lists, Adeptus Custodes had the strongest undefeated conversion rate. 4 of its 12 successful lists went undefeated, a rate of just over 33%. Next, we look at the disposition selected by each successful list. This chart shows the total number and percentage of successful lists using each of the 5 dispositions. Purge the Foe was the most common disposition, appearing in 108 lists, or just under 36% of the parsed sample. Disruption was the least common, with 21 lists accounting for 7.0%. The heat map brings the faction and disposition data together. The summary row at the top shows the total number and percentage of lists using each disposition. The faction rows below show how those choices were distributed across the successful armies in a sample. The most common faction and disposition pairing was Tau Empire using Purge the Foe, appearing 20 times. Purge the Foe had the broadest faction representation, with 19 different factions recording successful lists. Putting the 2 parts of the report together gives us a more complete view of the competitive landscape. The key takeaway this week is that raw win rate only tells part of the story. Orcs grabbed the headline with a 63.5% win rate, but sample size and 4-week trends give us the context. For the battlefield brief, the real story is not just who won the most, but who overperformed expectations, who underperformed, and which results are backed by enough players to matter. The overall list picture shows that Purge the Foe was the most common disposition, while Space Marines, Astartes, led the undefeated results. The combination data also points to Tau Empire, with Purge the Foe as the most frequently represented pairing. Key takeaway this week: keep an eye on Orcs as a possible rising faction, and watch Thousand Suns to see whether this week's drop is just noise or the start of a real decline. That concludes this week's Battlefield Brief. If you found the analysis useful, please like the video, subscribe to the channel, and share the briefing with another competitive Warhammer player. Thanks for watching, and we will see you in the next Battlefield Brief.